Welcome to another Perfect Search SEO training. Today we're going to be talking about Robots.txt and XML sitemaps. So first we'll start out with the Robots.txt. So a Robots.txt file is a text file that webmasters create to instruct search engine robots how to crawl pages on their website. So it's a file that's usually found within the FTP login. Essentially, on the CMS, you would upload it to the FTP folder. It's a directive for search engines that gives them instructions on what pages to crawl and what pages not to crawl. Usually within the Robots.txt file, there will also be an XML Sitemap Declaration, which we'll cover later, but that's usually an important part of it. And another thing to remember is that it's a signal, but not a law. So basically what that means is that having a Robots.txt file will send a strong signal to search engines, but it is possible that they might ignore it completely. But for best practices, you still want to make sure you have one, even though it's just a signal, so that you can send the strongest signal to search engine possible. So typically where it's found is at the root domain / robots.txt. So some important components of a robots.txt file. First is the user agent. The user agent is which search engine you're giving instructions to. So for example, Googlebot, Bingbot, Baidu, etc. Another important part of the Robots.txt file are directives. Directives are the rules. So there's two sets. One is allow and the other is disallow. So the purpose of them is pretty straightforward. Allow statements are directives or rules that state which URLs are allowed to be crawled by search engines, and disallow statements are pages that Robots.txt is instructing not to crawl. Another important part of the Robots.txt is including a link to the XML sitemap. So while the Robots.txt also has rules on what pages to crawl, another really good way to send a strong signal is just listing out exactly what pages you do want to be crawled, which is the XML sitemap. And then the final part of a Robots.txt that you'll see is a crawl delay. And this isn't as important as having the user agent or directives. Essentially, it's just saying whether there are any pages that you want search engines to crawl at a delayed rate. And the reason that you might want to do this is maybe you have a large e-commerce site and you have a lot of pages, and by crawling these pages at a high level, it could overload your server. So that's, a reason why you might want to have a crawl delay in there, but definitely not necessary for smaller websites. So diving deeper into directives, so there are certain expressions or syntax that go with the allow and disallow rules. And a general guideline is that the more specific rule will win. So there's two main expressions, one using the asterisk and one using the $ symbol. So the asterisk signals a wildcard that could represent any sequence of characters, and the $ signifies the end of a URL. So we have an example on the screen where the rule is disallowing the \***.php $. So with this first row, example.com/index.php, the verdict here is disallow. And the reason being that because there's a $ at the end of the disallow rule, this, any page that has anything before the PHP, if it ends in the PHP, is not allowed to be crawled. Whereas looking at the second example, where it's index.php and then there's a little bit of string of characters after it, this page actually is allowed to be crawled because the character after the PHT means it's not the end of the URL string. So this page technically is allowed to be crawled. So there are some subtleties there, but overall, the more specific you are with the rules, I guess the stricter it is. As I mentioned earlier, another really important part of the Robots.txt file is including a link to your site's XML sitemap. And the way that you do this, you just write sitemap : and then you link directly to the address. There are some ways to actually test out whether your Robots.txt is working. Within Google Search Console, there's a feature called the Robots.txt tester. So it's a really great way to edit your Robots.txt, play around with different rules, plug in example URLs to see whether your rules are working or not. And when you enter in a URL, it'll tell you whether there's an error, whether there's a warning. It'll highlight which rule is calling out. And yeah, it's a really good way to just sort of test out whether your Robots.txt is working. So next we'll move on to XML sitemaps. So an XML sitemap is essentially a roadmap of your website that leads search engines like Google and Bing to all of your important pages. They're really great for SEO as they allow search engines to quickly find your most essential website pages and make sure that everything that's important is being crawled. Where you'll find it is at the root domain /sitemap.xml. Sometimes this might be sitemap_index.xml if you're using a plugin, but typically that's how you find it. So it can be automatically generated through some CMSs. You can use Screaming Frog to create one, but above all, it should link to the most important pages on your website. And then just final thing here, it is definitely okay to have an XML sitemap that has multiple XML sitemaps in it. As far as best practices for XML sitemaps, you want to make sure that you're only including authoritative URLs that are end state and that you want to be indexed. Basically, what we mean by this is you don't want to have any duplicate content in there. You want to make sure that every single page is 200 status. If you're not sure what that means, definitely encourage you to check out our crawl status training. But yeah, no pages that are redirecting, no 404 error pages, no 500 server error pages, only 200 status, and only pages that you want to be indexed. So if you're an e-commerce site and you've got like a shopping cart page, or maybe there's a gated section of your website that you need a password, these are pages that you typically don't want to be indexed, so you wouldn't want to include those in an XML sitemap. How we generate this? There are some tools that you can use to do this. A lot of CMSs have plugins. For example, Yoast is a really popular one for WordPress. There are sitemap generators online, and you can also use crawler tools like Screaming Frog to crawl the whole website and then generate them manually that way. So a way to check whether your XML sitemaps are working is by looking at Google Search Console. Within Google Search Console, you can see which pages of your XML sitemaps are being crawled and indexed properly, and if there's any pages that are being excluded. Obviously, the ideal state would be having 100% of all of your pages indexed by Google, but that typically doesn't happen. Google isn't perfect. It won't necessarily index everything in there, but the reason that you have an XML sitemap is just to send a strong signal. So even if the ratio isn't 100%, still a best practice to have one. Great, so that was our training on Robots.txt and XML sitemaps. Hope you learned something about why they're important for SEO. Yeah, have a good one. Bye.